What is going on, you guys? Welcome to the Strong Life podcast. Today, I talked with Dr. Buckner about strength, all things strength, building muscle. Dr. Buckner was one of my professors at USF and University of South Florida in Tampa. He runs the muscle lab, and it's just a really, really interesting conversation to me, a deep dive into what it takes to build muscle, current literature around building muscle. We talk about how you might get your body to fatigue or failure to be able to build muscle and strength. And, just currently what's out there in the world on social media, what's right about social media, what's wrong with social media in terms of the information that we're consuming. I loved this conversation. I think you'll find it helpful. And as always, give the show a 5-star rating. Please, that's really helpful. Share the show and let me know if you have any questions, thoughts. I'm here for you. Thanks for listening. Welcome to the Strong Life podcast. I do have Dr. Sam Buckner, who is a professor of mine at USF in Tampa, University of South Florida. And I've been wanting you to be a guest for a long time. And so I didn't know if I would make it out the other side of that experience. So here I am. And I'm so happy to have you.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So we were actually just before I started recording, we were talking about the PhD process and tenure specifically, which he has at USF.
It was very exciting. It was the best news I got this summer.
Oh, it was just this summer?
When I got tenured, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I thought it was last year.
It like you apply a year before you get it. So I think I applied at the beginning of last year, and then the review and the completion of it, the voting, all those steps happened. But then they kept the news to themselves until the end of the summer.
Okay, just because they're like, oh yeah, we got to tell that guy. That's right.
Yeah.
We're what are we forgetting, boys?
Let him know if he has to go start searching for a new job.
Is it true that if you don't get it, you're just probably not going to get it?
Yeah, I
They're
don't
like, you
know.
don't have to go home, but you can't stay here.
I think they give you a year, perhaps, to still have your job.
Okay.
And start looking for something different. I think if you were to fail to get tenure, you'd probably, if you wanted to continue in academia, I think you'd probably start looking for more of a teaching role at a different university. So probably a job focused less on research.
Yeah. Okay, so Dr. Buckner, the reason that the thing that always comes to mind when I think of you, obviously, can you tell us a little bit about your lab at USF, your focus at USF, and then really today we're going to talk about all things strength. I'm sure we'll get into building muscle and that process and sort of the how those two things are related, and then I think we have a lot of things that will come up from there. But I'd love to hear a little bit about the lab for people who don't know. Probably a lot of people don't know. It's interesting too, like having gone to that program, it's kind of unbelievable the work that's pumped out of there. Like between your lab and Dr. Campbell's lab, it's like these are just actually real people doing the research that inform the industry, which I don't think we all think about, that it kind of comes from somewhere, but it's like you're one of the contributors, which is really exciting.
Yeah. So I'm director of the USF Muscle Lab, established, I guess, in 2018 when I started at University of South Florida, and we focus on skeletal muscle growth and adaptations to different training protocols. So I guess what I am really interested in is how we can make muscles grow and how we can manipulate different variables to achieve that muscle growth. And then I think an extension of that, I'm also quite interested in how do we measure muscle growth. So if we're trying to compare two different programs or two different training styles, let's say, and we're measuring the muscle, how good are we at actually measuring that muscle growth and determining if there's differences between group A and group B. A lot of my early work was blood flow restriction, so taking lower weights or lighter weight with and without the restriction of blood flow and seeing how that impacts muscle growth. I've done a lot on the time course of skeletal muscle growth. So, I have interest in how long does it take to reach, as much muscle growth as you can accomplish over a lifting career? What are the rates of muscle growth, and at what point is muscle growth largely plateauing? We did one of the first 1-year training studies. It's not published yet, but we finished data collection on that project. And I also, I guess currently I have a lot of interest in resistance training volume. So how many sets do you need to do in order to maximize a muscle growth response? And I kind of got interested in this one just because what I noticed is volume is this really popular topic, particularly at the intersection of science and social media. And especially since I've been a professor at USF, a lot of students consume their content on social media. And when I saw the perspective that they have, and I know that perspective comes from different influencers, science-based influencers, I realized that scientists overall have to do a better job themselves at conducting research and communicating that research, or else there's only ever going to be one story being told online. So our current work is looking at replicating some of the previous research that's been done to help people get a better idea of how many sets they need to be doing per exercise or per week, and that sort of thing.
So I also think it would be so interesting to be a professor and watch, obviously, young, students come in with their ideas of what's they're supposed to do. Even me and my demographic, which let's just say over 40 women and men, they're consuming the same, or maybe it's a little bit different, but some of the same social media, where I think all it does is I don't know that it's helpful. In my experience, it creates confusion for people. They don't typically go to see an influencer, even if it's somebody that they respect, they like, that they watch, and then go apply that principle. I get a lot of questions about, like, am I supposed to do 8 to 12 or 12 to 15? And I think at some point we're kind of splitting hairs.
Yeah, there's a lot of overthinking.
Yeah. Yes.
And there's a lot of I don't think it matters who you follow. Whoever you follow has their biases, and really their framework that they believe in. I mean, almost everybody has something they believe for X, Y, and Z reasons. And kind of relating it back to the teaching, I did realize very early on, students would say, I'd teach something in class and it'd be, this study shows this. And they'd raise their hand and they'd say, but so-and-so says this. And what I realized is I'm competing with social media voices, right, for authority on a topic. And I don't think it needs to be that way. The way I always answer those types of questions is, that's interesting. I'm sure that's based on a different piece of data. The piece of data that we're looking at right now suggests otherwise. It doesn't mean that person's wrong. It means that in this scenario, under these circumstances, maybe it's a little bit different. And I think a lot of what I try to do is help develop students' thinking so they can consume all different kinds of content and then make decisions for themselves based on an understanding of physiological principles and understanding that these things are a bit nuanced. And sometimes the interpretation of a study can lead us to think one thing when, maybe we're applying that the wrong way. I can give you a really good example if you like one.
I'd love one.
But I saw something the other day, and then Holly asked me a question the other day because I think she had heard something similar. And she says, or the content or the story that was out there was like, you could maintain all of your muscle growth with 1 set per muscle per week or something like this, right? Something that kind of seems like an extreme position. And maybe scientifically you can find a study to suggest that.
Okay.
Right.
So that would be, I have this amount of muscle, and in theory, all I have to do is do 1 set of chest to maintain this chest a week. Okay. That's what we're talking about. 1 set meaning one time I do 10 bench press and I'm like, oh, good to go.
Yes.
Okay. So that's the theory here.
So that's the theory. And that's something that you can find on evidence-based social media, right? Minimum effective dose to maintain your gains. And so as I was having this conversation with Holly, and Holly's an IFBB pro, so she competes professionally in the sport of bodybuilding in the bikini division. And, so she's pretty advanced. And she says, well, obviously that's not true. I can't maintain a competitive physique with 1 set per muscle per week. That's crazy. And I said, yeah, the problem with the scientific influencers is they take the study, and the study shows you can maintain your gains with 1 set per week. But what the influencer often forgets to say is the very small amount of gains that you accumulate over 8 weeks of training can be maintained over a subsequent 4 or 5 weeks of training when you reduce the volume to 1 set per week. So that study doesn't tell us that you can maintain everything you've ever gained by doing 1 set. The study is giving us a very small snapshot that you grew a very, very tiny amount in 8 weeks. And then when we change the volume after that 8 weeks, you can maintain that little amount of gains that you got perhaps in that 8-week period for a subsequent, let's just call it 8-week period of reduced volume. So it's so tempting, right, to read that paper and read that abstract and say, oh, gains were maintained with as little as 1 set per week. But the true context of that paper is they gained a very small amount, and they didn't lose that very small amount during the subsequent number of weeks. But it's so context specific. And I think oftentimes our communication of research lacks the actual context of what was observed and what circumstances were in place to observe that finding. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, it does. And also, I mean, when I think about back to the program in our, research methods class, and then certainly your class was about, I thought I would leave with clear black and white, this is how you train. And I left like, oh my gosh, like there's so much gray. There's like only gray. In fact, there's very few absolutes that I feel like I know at the end of the day, we could say these things are true. Like this has to be true for muscle growth. But like I was thinking, oh, I'll just come away with these perfect programming. These are the sets and reps. And of course there are guidelines, but learning to read research and then seeing headlines out there, as you say, that are just sort of, you have to ask yourself, like, what's the point of, it feels clickbaity sometimes, especially knowing what I know now. Like, why would you put that out there when there's so much more to the story? It seems like every study we read was like, it begs 10 more questions and needs 10 more studies to kind of complete that one piece, Yeah,
I often say it's hard for science to exist within the industry without kind of becoming the industry, right? So a lot of times I think the scientific, and it's probably a net positive, right? The amount of information that's getting out there. And I think people are learning a lot from science-based communicators, but inevitably things become oversold, overpromised, and then we sometimes put a disproportionate amount of confidence in scientifically communicated concepts because they seem more reliable, right? They seem like they would be coming from a better place. And I think it takes a lot of experience and understanding to realize the limitations of the data that, we often communicate. And honestly, you have to also kind of check yourself to not get too excited. If I show something in my lab, or I begin to maybe show something and it's not conclusive yet, scientists can get excited and want to share their thoughts and their beliefs of what they'll eventually be able to demonstrate, even if they haven't demonstrated that yet. And I think that happens online sometimes too. You get the crossroads of someone has data, but their beliefs are so strong in what the eventual outcome would be. And they sell people on that as opposed to the actual weight of the evidence.
Yeah. So one question I feel like you would have probably asked in class is, what is the one, like the most important, absolutely has to be there to be able to build muscle?
Yeah, I would ask that in class, I think. It's a good question.
Yeah. I'm like, please say the thing.
So when I think about muscle growth and what's necessary to induce muscle growth, I almost always go to fatigue on some level, right? So the way I always describe it in class is you have to activate and sufficiently fatigue the fibers that you're interested in growing. So that's why we had several conversations in class on the importance of training to failure. Now,
Yeah.
do you have to train to absolute failure all the time? Probably not. But do you have a better insurance policy that you're going to achieve growth if you're somewhere close to failure? Probably so. So it seems like a sufficient amount of contraction to induce a sufficient amount of fatigue is essential for muscle growth. And one of the best examples I can think of is the Morton paper from 2019 that compared low load training to high load training. So it's lifting lightweight or lifting heavyweight. And what the authors did is, actually, I think they did different repetition speeds as well. So like kind of a time under tension idea.
Yeah.
But anyway, they had people lift lightweight or heavyweight to failure or close to it over 8 to 12 week time period. And what they found is that muscle growth was the same. Now, if you were to look at EMG data, you would say, well, it looks like the group lifting heavy has much greater muscle activation. So they actually took muscle biopsies and looked at glycogen depletion, and that glycogen depletion was used kind of as a surrogate of muscle activation. If you deplete glycogen in a fiber, you've used that fiber, right? And that fiber is fatigued. So what they found overall is that the level of fatigue in both type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers was pretty similar. And over the course of several weeks of training, lifting lightweight or heavyweight, as long as the effort was there and it was close to failure, muscle growth was the same. So, we teach now in academic settings that there's a wide range of training loads that can be employed to achieve meaningful muscle growth.
Yeah. And we talked about that a lot also. Like, I mean, so let's say it is 30 reps to failure, built muscle in a study. That's fine. But you don't, who wants to do 30 reps? Like, or there's a place for 30 reps, or maybe there's blood flow restriction with a higher rep, lower weight. But like, you can, but it doesn't mean it's better or more efficient, or then you also miss the point of, potentially strength and strength gains if you're going to use the same 10 pounds in a bicep curl for 30 reps or something.
Yeah.
So I thought that was an interesting takeaway, is like, sure, you can, because I thought it would be like, no, you can't get to failure with lighter weight. But it's like, you can, but then there's a practical component. Like, what would the purpose be? Which it couldn't have its purpose.
Yeah, I think the purpose of employing that knowledge would be, obviously there's injury scenarios where people just physically can't lift heavy.
Yep.
Because of injury risk. I think back to when we were all in lockdown and no one could get to a gym, and maybe all you had were those 20 or 25 pound dumbbells. And, if that's all you're working with, you could, on not all movements, but on many movements, you could still achieve the amount of fatigue you'd need to induce muscle growth. I think it's also the reason why, band work in some scenarios is effective, even though it would be much higher rep training. But you can induce sufficient amount of fatigue oftentimes with really high rep training, and achieve muscle growth. So there are scenarios where I think it's useful, or maybe just lifts. People's preference is different across different exercises. So I don't think I've ever done 30 reps on a bench press. But I've probably done 30 reps on a more simple machine-based movement. Maybe it's just because I sat down on the machine and didn't choose a heavy enough weight, and I got halfway through the set. I'm like, I've already done this. Let's just go to I fail. But my preference is certainly different across different lifts in the gym.
Okay, that's interesting. There's a And that's advanced. I don't think people realize like how much freedom and flexibility they have in the gym. And I think that's one of the problems is that there's so much. It's always hard for me as a coach to kind of wrap my brain around how I best help somebody. And I think that's why, like, for me, one thing even though there's a wide variety of reps or a wide variety of ways to do something, and that from studies, and I know that from studies, but there's this component where that has to be delivered to a client who can apply it to their life, who may not have, who just is like, I just need to know what to do today. Like, I don't care about that next level of depth. Because ultimately, like, that's who I'm serving, is to keep it simple for somebody. What is the direction? And as they advance, then it's fun to play around in the gym and know that, like, for example, I'm absolutely smoked from a workout on Monday. And like, I want to lift. I feel better when I do. Today would be a really good day for like a higher rep, low weight, just to get me moving and get that exposure,
Yeah.
There's ways you can apply it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think another benefit to lifting heavy are the strength adaptations that, you don't necessarily get when you go with a lighter alternative. So, the low load training, band training, right? Or just low load training in general, I think above 15, 20 repetitions, you get that muscle growth adaptation, but you're not getting the same strength adaptation. And just purely from a tracking perspective or progress perspective, a lot of people like to gauge their progress as, what is strength done across this training block. And it does become a little bit different when you're employing lower load training, because you're not seeing the same increases in strength that you see with a more traditional 8 to 12 or a 6 to 8 repetition range. So again, there's the preference of the how do you induce hypertrophy, but then there's also that layer of, do I also want functional adaptations? And the strength adaptation you're going to get between those different forms of training for hypertrophy is going to be different. And
Right.
I think most people they want growth and they want strength. So
yeah, and they want to get leaner, and they want it all, and they want to gain no body fat during this process. That's always the request, like the a la carte request. Okay, I want to build muscle, build strength, get leaner, and
compete in Ironman.
And also do bodybuilding competition. Oh, by the way, yeah. So can we talk a little bit about failure? Because one thing was interesting. Failure is, I cannot do one more rep. Absolutely. And I remember you talking a lot about in the lab, when you're observing somebody, it's really hard for people to actually get to failure. Like, at least for me, there's usually a fear that kicks in. So with some exercises where I feel weaker, I have a wonky knee and I think it's going to, maybe give out on me. But can you talk a little bit about the importance of failure? Like, what is the extra gain to failure?
Yeah, I think that training to failure is just a way to ensure that you're getting activation and creating that anabolic stimulus in as much as the fibers involved in that movement as possible. We typically say you need to get close to it. I don't think you necessarily have to train to absolute failure on every set if muscle growth is the goal. I think it would probably be more important if let's say you're only doing one working set because you're really limited in time. If you only can do one working set, then I think getting that set as close to failure as possible, or maybe even doing a drop set, might be the best way to maximize the growth potential you can get out of that session. But the way I kind of view it is, you're trying to sufficiently activate and fatigue the fibers involved in a movement. And because of the way we train, when you train to or near failure, I believe you're getting most of what you're getting out of that exercise out of the first set.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I believe
I don't remember you saying that before, but
my ideas come in waves, so I may or may not have said it.
Now that I've heard you say everything ever, but yeah, okay, that's interesting.
And like, for example, on a simple machine movement targeting a muscle, I do believe you're getting the majority of the stimulus from your first set. And you're getting a little bit more out of set 2 and a little bit more out of set 3. And somewhere between those sets, the signal's plateauing, right? Because when you train a muscle, you try to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, and then eventually that protein synthetic response is going to plateau. You can't keep doing sets and keep getting more growth, right? It's not like eating more calories and gaining more weight. Training and adapting as far as a growth stimulus doesn't work quite the same. So I do think you're getting the majority of it on that first set. And then that second set's just making sure, in somewhere between 3 and 4 sets, I think you stopped getting benefit out of that training. Now, on a complex movement like the squat, like the bench, I think these movements involve a lot more muscles. And there's more complexity. So, because you have, the bench, you also have your triceps that are contributing some level of force. I think in more complex movements, the importance of additional sets is greater because there's just more to fatigue and activate. And you're trying to stimulate muscle growth and as many of the muscles involved in the movement as possible. And it's less direct in some of these other movements. So I think the importance of additional sets and sets 2 or near failure becomes more important as the movement becomes more complex. In general, I don't think the recommendations as far as the literature is concerned changes too much across exercises. But that's just kind of the way I think about my training. When you're doing a preacher curl machine, you know exactly what muscle you're turning on. And when you fail to do another repetition, you know it's because of this muscle. Now, when you do a squat, you have the same level of confidence that the reason that you couldn't do another repetition was, the exact part of the quads that you're trying to grow was fatigued. I think there's just less directness there. But across the exercise sets to failure, you know what muscles are involved in that movement, and you still have a pretty good level of confidence that you activated and fatigued those muscles. Again, I think activating and fatiguing the muscles is the stimulus for growth. So the goal across your exercise sets is to achieve that process.
So I think that's interesting. Like that, it does take a little bit of pressure off that every set, every rep, well, not every rep, obviously, but you're lifting heavy enough to get to the point where you just absolutely can't do one more. That's your not just where you get the sensation of the burn, but that's, you almost have to work beyond that. I always feel like it was like, once you feel like you can't do another one, do 2 more, and then it is very hard to articulate in words without showing people what that's like, which is kind of one of the things I try to do all the time, is this is also what it looks like. This is what it should kind of feel like.
Yeah. I would be really interested to design a really good study where one group does just 1 set to failure, but it's, just a really intense, truly failure. Maybe even try to do an additional assisted rep and then compare that to a group that does, 3 sets.
And then do like 10 negatives, really failure. Like now you can't even get up, but you're going to have to lower it. We'll get you up, but you have to go down.
Yeah. And I'm sure there's listeners out there that have done a set of exercise where that 1 set toasted them, or like, is it called myo reps? So some people like to do the myo rep sets, where you just pause for a little bit and then keep going. And then, one myo rep set, like if you complete a myo rep sequence, I think there's probably a little benefit to revisiting that movement. I think you've already maximized probably what you can get out of that movement. So, I think a lot of this hasn't been demonstrated with study design, maybe enough times yet for us to have confidence in it. But the way I think about adaptation, I would expect something like that to equal probably 3 or 4 regular sets.
Yeah. And just for people listening, hypertrophy is muscle growth. And then I did a podcast. I was talking about adaptation, which you hear that a lot. Obviously, it's the adaptation just means your body is building muscle and adapting to the work that you're asking it to do on a consistent basis over time. So I use this analogy, like failure would be like if you're moving, right? And you have to lift a bureau and it's way too heavy, you have to put it down. That's failure. But you didn't like build muscle that day. You didn't wake up the next day and you're like, wow, look at me. I've got you. You're just going to be sore as hell. But if you did that same thing over and over again, eventually that becomes lighter. You have to lift it a few times before you have to put it down. And the adaptation is that you got stronger, your muscle grew. And that's what we're talking about here. Ultimately, building muscle is the adaptation and to demanding that your body do the same things over and over again. And I think it's interesting because the biggest habit that because, I'm out here in the world, I know you are too, but we are in different ways. And so I see the behavior around this wanting to build muscle and wanting to build strength, but stopping, jumping around program to program, stopping for 6 weeks because life happened, starting up again, doing an 8-week challenge, then stopping. And it's just, you're never going to get there. You have your frustrations with like social media content, and I have my frustrations with like that I want this, but the concept is hard for people to understand that you have to keep going to get those adaptations.
Yeah. Adaptation's slow. And
it's so slow.
When people sign up for our studies, they're excited. They're like, oh, am I going to see growth? And I always have to answer, we'll probably be able to measure that you grew, but you're not going to be able to tell that you've grown.
1 centimeter, not even. That would be huge, right?
1 centimeter would be unbelievable.
Which we talked about in the tricep study.
Yeah.
Remember?
Yeah. I still talk about that tricep study. 47.8% increase in tricep CSA.
Yeah. Damn.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. And actually unbelievable. So
truly,
there's something that people talk about in the world a lot about that I think would be interesting to hear your thoughts. When we lift weights, we tear down muscle fiber. Is that really what's happening? And then we sleep, growth hormone, all of the things happen. We eat protein, we build that muscle over time. So we're not building it while we lift. I think that's, some people think like I'm building it now, but what is happening? Is it tearing?
Probably sometimes.
I mean, I feel like I have.
So yeah, one of the things I grew up hearing is that hypertrophy is this micro tears in your muscle.
Yeah.
And then you build it back, but you build it back stronger. And this is what causes adaptation. Muscle damage is part of the training process, but I'm not convinced, and I think most people aren't convinced that it's the reason that we grow. And I think there's several reasons why people hold this belief. And the biggest one is, the first time you train, first time you lift heavy, is the time where you see the most muscle damage. And when we say damage, if you zoom in on a muscle, right, the muscle's made out of these contractile proteins, and they're arranged with structural proteins that kind of hold them in place. And we call it a sarcomere. And a sarcomere is the smallest functional unit of a skeletal muscle. And it's these things called Z-discs, and they suspend the contractile components which overlap, and they latch on and pull each other inward that shorten muscle. Well, if you look at those sarcomeres after a heavy lifting session, a lot of times they call it Z-line streaming. The structural components are all in disarray. It's not arranged nicely anymore. And that would be kind of a classic indicator of muscle damage. Now, the first time you lift heavy and you experience muscle damage, the second time you expose yourself to that same training stimulus, you have much less damage. The third time, you have even less damage. So it's called the repeated bout effect. We robustly protect ourselves from muscle damage after we've experienced it. And for that reason, I think a lot of people don't consider damage necessary to induce growth. Muscle growth is about activating signaling proteins, which activate other proteins, which stimulate muscle protein synthesis to tell your muscles to grow. And that happens independent of a damaging response. So damage can certainly happen with training, but I wouldn't say damage is the reason that we're growing from training. And I would also say that damage isn't necessary to grow. The reason I don't believe it's necessary is if you lift with these, how we talked about lighter weight training is effective. Well, structurally, lighter weight training puts less stress on the muscle and leads to overall less muscle damage. And when I say less muscle damage, that classic Z-line streaming, the disarray of the fibers themselves, we see less of that damage with lightweight training, but we see the same muscle growth. So that gives us at least some indication that with less damage, we can get the same growth as more damaging protocols. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I have been somebody who that's how it's taught, actually. It's sort of described like, this muscle fiber tears, and then you refuel, eat enough protein, do all of the things, and then it repairs, but then it grows back like larger, which is the adaptation. And maybe that's the easier way to explain it. Like there is this thing out there that as a coach, I'm always like, how do I kind of boil this down so that it's just, okay, I get it. And obviously not everybody cares. If you're listening to this podcast, you're interested, and particularly this episode, but the way you kind of communicated it is, I think, even as simple as the other way, which is it's tearing down muscle fibers, like stimulating muscle protein synthesis is just what's happening.
Yeah. The other interesting thing, at least it's interesting to me, is the fact that muscle soreness does not line up perfectly with muscle damage, right? So a lot of these studies that have looked at, again, we call it Z-line streaming, the disarray of the fiber, indicating that the proteins have been kind of ripped apart in a sense. That data and the time course of those changes does not line up perfectly with the time course of when you get sore. So, a lot of people use soreness as a proxy of, I really damaged my muscles.
Right.
And I don't know how much confidence we can have that that's always the case. I don't know if I went over this data with you in class, but there's some data that shows that, the days following when you're remodeling, you have kind of this rush of immune cells into your muscle fibers to kind of clear out some of the debris. So some people think that's why we have this delayed onset muscle soreness, because it's called neutrophil invasion into our muscle fibers, and it's kind of a delayed response. You have the damage, and then a couple days later, you have this flux of immune cells into your muscle cells to help clear it out. Maybe that's why we get sore a couple days after. Because a lot of people experience soreness maybe 24 hours after they train. Maybe it's 36 hours after they train. Maybe it's 48. But overall, I would say I don't think anyone has the exact answer as to why we get sore
2 days later, like me, for example, after Monday. Yeah, it's interesting. There's just a delayed onset muscle soreness that and you're right, it's very inconsistent. To me, it always feels like if I do something new, like totally new, like we did 1,000 step-ups with 35-pound ruck for Chad, the hero watt on Veterans Day. And that is like not my normal thing, obviously. And it just, disrupted sleep. It did a lot of things to me, and today is way worse than yesterday.
Mm-hmm. Well, we go over the indirect markers of muscle damage, and the most reliable one, the one that does line up most often with actual presence of damage, is a decrease in performance. Right? So it's typically measured in research is isometric force. So a simple strength task, if I have you pull on a handle to use your bicep, I should pretty reliably get the same number. And if that number decreases, that's a pretty reliable indicator of muscle damage. And it's much more reliable than soreness. So in the research, your actual performance or strength capabilities is a better indicator that you have muscle damage than soreness itself.
Okay, that's interesting.
Just kind of interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if performance is dropping off, it could be that, okay, you're still damaged from a previous session. You haven't completely recovered.
So how long does it take for someone to heal from something okay, so let's say you have a, squats to failure on Tuesday. Do I need to wait a whole week to do squats to failure again?
I don't think so. I think the time course is tricky, and I think it's different for different individuals. And like we said, some people don't experience soreness to 48 hours later.
Mm-hmm.
It depends on what the underlying reason for that is. Even if you're not fully recovered, I think you can still train the muscle and stimulate a muscle protein synthetic response, meaning you can still induce growth. Have you compromised the intensity and the effectiveness of that workout? Maybe. I think full recovery is probably the more optimal scenario. But I definitely don't think it's a week. I think most cases 48 to 72, and maybe a good indicator would be, 72 hours is often used in the research to allow swelling and edema to kind of dissipate. Or maybe I think 3 days is a good rule of thumb that you're probably completely recovered. But I think a lot of people out there probably train with a greater frequency than that.
I do too.
And I don't think that's a problem. And I especially with, how most people train, if you introduce a new movement and really went crazy, maybe that's a reason to give yourself an extra rest day than you typically would. But I think most people probably train with 48 hours in between, and I think that's okay.
So what is and I know we're going to get on, I want to kind of do like a quick trending hot topics, but what is, I feel like there's no way I'm going to be able to nail you down on this one. What is the best training protocol for somebody? And you can tell me if there's a difference between men and women, age, whatever, for somebody whose goal is to build muscle.
Okay.
I know.
Well,
Dr. Buckner, I want to build muscle. I need to know what to do every day. What do I do?
All right. So,
and I'm not coming from the couch.
Yeah.
This isn't couch.
I think I can't give a quick answer to this because I don't think there is one. I mean, the quick answer would be you need to activate and sufficiently fatigue your muscles with a sufficient amount of volume. And I think for me to answer this question, I have to first acknowledge that science doesn't perfectly answer this question. Science tries to tell you how much volume you need, but science does a pretty poor job at that. Because of the way we've designed our studies, they don't really inform us properly. So you need to train the muscle group that you're interested in with, I think the literature would say 15 to 20 weekly sets, right? Training to or near volume, or to or near failure on those sets. And then your rep range that you choose, that's up to your preference, right? You can pick on the lower end of 8 reps or on the higher end of 30, 35 repetitions. But if you also want strength adaptations, definitely go with the heavier weights and the less repetitions. The reason I said science can't perfectly tell you how much volume you need is because the way we've designed studies is not the way that people train, right? You'll hear studies where they do 48 working sets, 50 plus working sets. But a lot of these studies, they will only do 1 or 2 exercises per muscle group. And I think the way most people train is they do multiple exercises for their quads and different exercises for their glutes and different exercises for their shoulders. You don't just stick to 2 exercises and increase your volume on those 2 exercises. Most people choose different exercises because they target the muscle differently. And that's the reason why I'm hesitant to ever give out volume recommendations is because, well, does a flat bench and an incline bench grow your chest differently? If it does, then that volume's not the same volume. There's overlap between those exercises where you're training the same fibers, but there's areas of non-overlap where you're training a different aspect of the muscle in a different way. So I think you have to pick movements that target muscle that you care about. And within that movement, I recommend 3 to 4 sets. And then frequency, I would say 2 to 3 times.
Mhm.
So I don't know if that's helpful, but I think of it differently than a lot of people because, the industry and the science-based community often just gives kind of these blanket recommendations of weekly sets. And I struggle with that just because if I told you to do 25 weekly sets in your quads and you just went and did 25 weekly sets of knee extensions, how could that be a proper use of volume, right? You've done the same movement probably too many times and you filled your cup but kept pouring your volume in that same cup and you're not going to get anything out of it at a certain point.
So in that case, you're talking about, I think now we're talking a little bit more about variation too.
Yeah.
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 So how important is that?
Again, this is an area that I think science hasn't completely answered everything yet, but there was a recent study that compared, what did they compare? They compared the leg press to the knee extension or something like this, and then they found differential growth amongst the muscles of the quadriceps, suggesting that these exercises do have overlap, but they also have independent characteristics that make one movement superior to the other movement. So I think variation is really important, and it's going to come down to, what a person values. What are they trying to grow, right? And that's the reason why, the best example I can think of is Holly, because she's training very specifically right now. And in the bikini category, they have to train their glutes and shoulders quite a bit. But for glutes, she has different exercises that are meant to target different aspects of the glute. So there's maybe hip thrust in there, but there's also an abduction exercise and a kickback exercise because they each target the muscle a little bit differently to maximize the possibility that each muscle is growing. And it would be unusual for one exercise to maximize growth of all the muscles involved in a muscle group, right? So I think that's why variation is important. But I also don't think we have a robust literature base to kind of pull that from, but it's intuitive, right? Like we've all done exercises and where you feel an exercise, right? If you feel muscle fatiguing in an exercise, the area you feel fatigued is probably the area that's going to grow. And the areas that you don't feel like you're using, well, they're not going to grow. Even if the sign on the machines shows that muscle lit up, if you're not fatiguing that muscle and activating that muscle and using that muscle, it's not going to grow.
Yeah. And this is really interesting because I think, and just to bring it back, like what we're specifically talking about here is muscle growth. And then we've dipped into strength a little bit, but it's really like bodybuilding. If you want to build your physique and build muscle, is the best training style, really. I mean, there's I'm not seeing any way around that. Meaning, I have a lot of women who are doing other things like CrossFit and, boot camps, and they're just not getting necessarily the physique results they were hoping for. And because I do CrossFit, but I also do accessory and bodybuilding, because I know the volume isn't there and the purpose isn't always to get to fatigue. A lot of it is conditioning. That's high so like when I do a workout there, I know this is conditioning where the general population might be thinking, why are my shoulders not popping here? Why hasn't my physique changed? That training style is really performance based.
Yeah.
It just is. So I'm just sitting here thinking like all of my women who do CrossFit are like, if I had anybody who said I want to build the physique, I would flip up the training methodology to bodybuilding. Like bodybuilders aren't doing CrossFit,
or add in the muscle groups that they care about.
Yeah, that's what I do. That's all I do. Yeah.
Maybe they care about a couple of muscles, and by adding 3 or 4 exercises a couple times a week, they can get the best of both worlds.
Right. Like you stay after open gym, or you come in a little bit early and you target your glutes, you target your shoulders, your back. And that's, that you'll have a well-rounded program there. But it is one of those things where, like, I want people that I work with to do things they love and be active and get performance gains and strength gains. But it's very frustrating for people who do all that work and don't see the fruits of their labor. And it's training style and nutrition, Yeah.
Yeah. But I think I also often like to mention the fact that, bodybuilding expectations are, they're really high expectation for anybody. To think you're going to maximize and grow every single muscle, with a career, with a life, with other hobbies, with any of this, there's very few people out there that are probably maximally stimulating muscle protein synthesis with the ideal frequency and volume in every single muscle group.
Right.
That's just a tall order.
Consistently over years with the diet to go along with it. Like it's right. Like it's so hard when people want, I have people who I know what they want. Yeah. And I know that it's not that it's not possible. It's that it's unlikely,
Yeah.
It's just really important to be you versus you. Because I think even if you look at somebody like Holly and you think like, that's the physique I want, it's like, well, okay. But then you have to do what Holly does, and you have to have been who Holly was her whole life, and you have to have Holly's genetics, and you have to have Holly's training. So, I mean, you know what I mean? Like you can't just, it's not like, oh, do this and it's 8 to 12 reps to failure 4 days a week and hit your protein and macros. And, it's just a matter of time. It's like, that's the stuff that kills me as a coach is like, you can get the best you, but she's next level physique,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can make steps in the right direction towards what your goals are. But oftentimes you have to be realistic with those goals and then also be patient and say, you know what, it's probably unlikely I'm going to maximize all of these muscles over this training block. Let's maybe focus on a few things that we want to improve. And if you kind of reduce the number of goals you have at a single point in time, you might have a greater likelihood of achieving, I want larger biceps, or I want to work on my calf muscles, right? Whatever it might be.
Right. And it's centimeters at best. That is what's tricky. Do you see there is a ultimate potential for somebody? I did listen to a lecture is it Alan I forget how to pronounce his last name.
Alan Aragon?
Yeah, Alan Aragon. And he was talking about ultimate potential for muscle growth. And it was sort of like this idea that coming out of the gate, couch to lifting, first year would be superhero status, building muscle, and then it would slowly decline over the years. Male being like max he could build is 45 pounds of muscle. Female max was like 20 to 25 pounds of muscle. And then he said men can build, I don't know, I'm just like a pound a month on average in year one. Women could build a half a pound a month on average in year one, and kind of went through that. And that's kind of our ultimate potential. I started thinking back about my own body and physique. And I was bike racing at 117 pounds, which is very low, 117 to 120. With all legs, no upper body strength. And then over the years, lifted and got myself, now I'm about 140 and I lift and I'm sort of feel like I'm pretty much maxed at this point.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that concept? Like I always tell my clients, you're not going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. Like it's just, but I don't really know how do you know?
Yeah. It's hard to, and I teaching exercise science classes. I used to begin. It might have been my neuromuscular class. or it might have been strength and conditioning. I can't recall. But I would tell the students, I'd say, how many of you have been lifting for 3 or 4 years now? And I'd say, well, you've gained most of the muscle that you can gain. You are largely what you're capable of being is what you are right now. And to a certain extent, I believe that that's true. I think if you've been lifting for a number of years, you've experienced the majority of the muscle growth that you can achieve. And we used to have this guy at University of Mississippi, and he pretty much lived in the gym. Like, you could go to the gym any time of day and you're going to see him. He was always training. But I would say he never looked any different. The 4 years I was there, at the end, he looked the same as he looked at the beginning. And that's because he had already achieved his muscle growth and he was in the maintenance phase. And that's not to say that, maybe one muscle group could have been lagging a little bit. The muscles, probably some of them fluctuated, right? You get a little tweak in your quad, you train your quads a little bit less while they heal, and muscle growth goes down, and then you bring it back up. Your training becomes more and less focused throughout a training year, and I think that impacts growth for sure. We wrote a paper, Muscle Growth to Infinity and Beyond, and the premise of this paper is to look at the time course of muscle growth. And Brittany Counts was the lead author on this particular paper. And I think we concluded that, this is just looking at the studies that do exist. The majority of muscle growth seems to happen pretty quickly, and then it plateaus. And that doesn't mean, and I think the time mark she put on it was somewhere around 3 months. Like, when you read a study, if a study's 6 months, you're going to see growth, and that growth is going to slow down and it's going to essentially plateau. It doesn't mean that you're no longer growing. It means that you're probably growing at such a slow rate that it's really hard to measure. So I think certainly the most growth that you're going to see and experience is at the beginning. And then with increased time, it's just harder to facilitate gains, harder to see those gains, and certainly harder to measure those gains. So it doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but you have much less confidence that meaningful growth is occurring.
Right.
The more progressed you are in a lifting career.
Right. And then, of course, for me as a coach focused on nutrition, obviously we want to see the fruits of our labor. And that's where I always say, body fat is it's like having a full snowsuit on, and you can lift weights and you're lifting heavy and you're seeing it, you can feel it. I was like, I feel there's a 6-pack in there. I can feel it. It's in there. And it's like, now the diet is where we sort of shed that snowsuit and reveal what has been built, So it's always important to lift weights, even if your body composition isn't where you want it to be, because if you can dial in that diet, which is obviously we're talking about habits and behaviors that are very difficult for people and run, a wide variety of, issues people have, making that physique come together. But it's always worth it to lift weights and then continue to work on that diet piece to be able to see the fruits of your labor, which is ultimately what, a lot of people are really looking for.
Yeah, I agree. And then the patience part, just because, most of my research is 8 and 12 weeks, and we consistently see muscle growth, and we measure it and we know it's occurred. We have a pretty good level of confidence that it's occurred. But if you did a before and after photo in any of our studies, you would never know the difference. So
yeah, right.
The amount of time it takes to be able to reflect back on your training experience and realize that meaningful growth has occurred, it just takes patience and knowing that what you're doing is following certain principles that we know that if you're training in this way, if you're training with sufficient volume to near failure, you're focusing on different muscle groups. If you're capable of muscle growth, that muscle growth will occur. And then that's, of course, also, if your rest is there, if you're recovering, and then if your diet's there, right? So
yeah, it's a lot of things.
If you have these ingredients and you have the patience to keep seeing it through, if you're capable of growing, you will experience
Yeah.
muscle growth.
And the patience of seeing it through for forever. Like, it's not like for a few weeks. It's like just like as a lifestyle, I think is probably a good way to adopt it. But so when you we talked before we started recording about like things you're talking about right now and what's hot in the industry. You mentioned rest period and range of motion, which we did it. I mean, I wrote a paper on range of motion. I don't know if you remember. It was my best piece after I stopped the program, before I stopped the program. I don't even remember it. I don't know if I was up all night writing it, but talk about those two things that are going on right now.
Yeah. So, I think I decided maybe a few years ago, my mentor always said, science is self-correcting, and, things will come and go, and, given enough time, science will kind of correct itself. And if a bad idea gets out there, it just eventually it's going to correct. And, I believe that. I think that's largely true, but I also think that we're at this time where science and industry are becoming blurred, and industry folks are getting involved in science. And I don't know if it dilutes the science or not, but I certainly think it has the capacity to dilute the quality of science, especially when you mix branding and businesses and content creation, the need for new content with new and exciting ideas. And it also brings in different conflicts of interest that we haven't really had to think about in science before, because, people like me, no one knows I exist, right? I mean, people know I exist, but it doesn't have any bearing on my work. I do my work, I publish my work, I enjoy my work, but I don't have to promote my work to do my work. But social media makes things a little bit different.
No pressure for you to come up with a new like clickbait study or something like the headline. You just say, this is what we found.
And clickbaiting it would do nothing other than ruin my credibility.
Right.
So I would never want to clickbait something. So yeah, the range of motion thing, maybe we can talk about that one first. And for me, I don't know if you were in the program when Wayne was in the program.
Yeah, I was. Yeah.
So Wayne's the one that brought range of motion to my attention. And it was a neuromuscular exercise physiology. And he raised his hand and said, what do you think of range of motion? I heard now that it's only the long muscle lengths that are causing muscle growth. And I said, interesting. I would assume they're implementing titin, a structural part of the muscle fiber is the reason why. And to me, it was interesting because I hadn't really heard about it. It wasn't this thing in the literature. Like, scientifically speaking, it wasn't this pressing issue. And I went on to learn that it was big on social media. So it was this thing that was being discussed a lot on social media, and specifically, and some of the listeners have probably heard of this, the idea that training at long muscle lengths is the most important part of your training. So if you're doing a bench press, the bottom part of the lift where the bar is against your chest, where your chest is lengthened, it's stretched, that's the important part of the movement. On a bicep curl, the bottom part of the bicep curl, where your muscle's most lengthened, that's the most important part of the movement. And just take every exercise. And this is what's been communicated in social media. So we reviewed the literature, and Enrique, who I've worked with for years now, and he's still teaching for us at the university. We wrote a paper and kind of reviewed the literature to kind of present a different narrative. And what we found is when we looked at a lot of these papers, they weren't necessarily supporting what you're hearing on social media. And you brought up the triceps earlier. That was one of the best examples. So there was this paper by Goto that compared training full range of motion for the triceps versus training middle range of the motion for the triceps.
Yeah.
And middle range of the motion led to superior muscle growth than full range of motion, which I'm having a hard time making sense of why that would be the case. But that middle range of motion group has been portrayed online as training with longer muscle lengths, which makes no sense to me because they're the group that never went to long muscle lengths. So that's been, in my opinion, completely misrepresented online.
Okay, so let's talk about what that looks like, because this is going to be like my first video.
Okay.
So I'm doing a tricep extension,
Yeah.
and this is full range of motion.
Yeah.
Okay, this is partial range.
Partial range, yeah.
Okay,
Right.
so you do see people training with different. You have a lot of people who are just trying to get, quote, the burn, which you'll get that somewhere in a partial range of motion. So those are the two things. This is full range, and then this is partial range. And you're saying the study said you must train full range. That's where it's at.
Well, the study said the middle range of motion was superior.
Oh, I
and
thought
their data showed that.
Okay, so they're saying middle range, if I do this, better, which was weird, right? It was like, you were
I
like,
thought it was.
No, I was too. I was like, well, we don't see everybody training like that at the gym. That's interesting. Nobody's really doing that.
But the important thing about this paper was the full range of motion group had about 28% increase in tricep CSA. And the middle range of motion had, like we said, 48.7% increase in tricep CSA. Both of those numbers are so out of line with anything you'd expect to see. Typical change in tricep CSA over 8 to 12 weeks would be 6 to 8%, not 28 to 48%. So I'm less interested in range of motion in that paper and more interested, how in the world did we get these numbers? But that data has been hijacked by the range of motion people, like the social media range of motion people that are selling that middle range of motion as a long range of motion. And that's just bizarre. That's selectively trying to use a piece of evidence to fit a narrative.
Wait, how could you possibly sell mid-range as long range?
And this is the stretch of
how
logic.
Could that even?
They're saying it's more total time at longer muscle lengths.
Oh, that's right. Now I remember this from the class.
But isn't that bizarre?
I just think about like application out there in the world. Yeah. Like what?
And this is more of a nuanced scientific frustration with how people are manipulating how you represent something. For the listener, maybe a more important thing here is data can be misused by smart people, right, to lead you to believe one thing when maybe that thing isn't necessarily represented by the data that they're using. I think the listener might care less about this nuanced discussion about the intricacies of these studies that are being used. What's important here is data is being misused to make points on social media. And the message that's being conveyed currently is favor the lengthened position. It's superior. Now, there are other studies in the calves. There's some data that looks like training at longer muscle lengths is important, or training in a lengthened position. For example, a standing calf raise looks like it's better for both medial and lateral calf growth compared to a seated calf raise. And when you are in a seated calf raise, it's been argued that the calf is in a more shortened position.
Yeah.
That one makes sense, but that's more of there's a kind of a biomechanical explanation as to why that's the case. But this idea is spread like wildfire on social media and has been blanketed across all these different exercises and muscles as the way that we need to train now. And if you're approaching things from an evidence-based perspective, the data is not there to make the claims that are being made right now.
Yeah, interesting. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I'm not in that space right now I don't know where my what I've been talking about lately. I'm getting puppies and stuff like that.
That sounds better than what I'm getting.
But it's true. Like you get like what you're interested in, you get fed. And I haven't, but I was for years, like all up in the mix of all the, getting fed all of that stuff. So, but it's been a minute since it's been on the top of my radar. But as a consumer, the thing I'm fighting off oftentimes are things like that. Hey, I saw something or I read something, and then it will kind of contradict, like it says I could do 30 reps, or I'm sure at some point. And I have definitely had range of motion questions. One would be, if I'm doing a pull-up, for example, is it better for me to start from a dead hang, or can I kind of do these halfway pull-ups? It's the same answer for me would be, well, if you're trying to get stronger at a dead hang pull up, that's not going to do it. So if you're trying, if you're trying to build strength, that's probably not the way to do it. If you're trying to recruit more muscle fiber, you just moved into a higher rep. What's the point sort of doing it that way? That's my question,
Yeah. The functional benefit versus the kind of the muscle growth adaptations. And in both examples, I think if you care about the function, then you need to train the way that you want to get stronger at. In both of the examples that we've provided, there are people that would say you need the 4-range of motion to get the long muscle length for your triceps to maximize muscle growth. Some people would hold that view, and I can't say that they're wrong. I can say maybe I share a different view in that as long as you're fatiguing the muscle, either way you'd approach the triceps, I think it would probably grow your back similarly. And I guess your biceps are probably getting some growth stimulus as well. But those are two different discussions, right? The discussion on muscle growth from that exercise versus the discussion on the strength or functional adaptation from that exercise.
Right. I mean, we've mostly focused here on muscle growth, but I do think, that it is that the concept of lower rep, heavier is going to get you stronger. I always say this to people, like if you pick up if I program, because I have an app and I have programming, which gets you the base, each program gets you the baseline reps and sets that I believe would, support a goal of muscle hypertrophy. But if you are, the misunderstanding is I just do 8 to 12 reps of some weight. Your body doesn't go, 8 reps, time to grow, 12 reps. It's not a number here. Is it time under tension, or is it you have to pick up why is 8 to 12 a typical number for a goal of muscle hypertrophy, I guess?
That's a good question. I have my own theory. My theory is not proven.
I do too, but yeah.
So if you dip below 8 to 12, you will still fatigue and reach failure, right? If you do a 1 RM, you'll reach failure. So maybe the question is, if I'm saying that fatigue and failure is what equals growth, well, why does 3 reps to failure not cause growth, but 8 to 12 reps to failure does? And my theory is the fatigue is of a different nature. My theory is when the weight gets too heavy, you're now fatiguing not your fibers, but maybe your connective tissue is experiencing fatigue before your fibers are actually able to fatigue. So if you think about it, when you do a 1 RM, and that's the most extreme example we can use. When you do
1 rep max.
Yeah. A max attempt, you can't do that twice, right? Most people can't, let's say you max out on your bench press. You can't go max out on your bench press again. So there's something occurring there. There's fatigue. You can't lift the weight twice. You're strong enough to lift it, but why can't you lift it twice? And I think a lot of that is communication with the brain. You're preventing yourself from lifting it again because you're at risk for injury, right? Lifting that heavy of a weight.
Because who would do that? Yeah.
When you can no longer lift 8 or 12 reps, I believe now your fibers are actually fatigued. Your fibers can't produce the force necessary to overcome that weight. I think the nature of the fatigue is different as the repetitions get higher, meaning that I think the fatigue is more muscular with higher reps, and it's more connective tissue, injury preventative with lower reps. And I think crossing that threshold is important for being able to induce growth. Aside from that, I think it's simply a volume issue. I think you have to have sufficient activation in fatigue with sufficient volume. And for some reason, below, some people say 6 reps is still hypertrophic and it can still cause muscle growth. And I think that's true. I have less confidence in 6 reps than I do 8 to 12 reps. But regardless, wherever the cutoff point is, I think it's sufficient activation and fatigue with sufficient volume. So you need to activate that with enough signal to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So there is a volume component.
So that's interesting. I mean, there has to be a number because we're humans and we count, and that's how we do it. Like, you could just say to somebody, pick up enough weight where for like, I don't know, maybe 30 seconds or so, you're doing the weight and then you can't do it anymore. But we just need more direction than that. It's just the way that it is to get somebody to be able to perform and, reach their goals. So the most important part of this is that you don't just stop and put it down at 12. If you could go to 20, you should go to 20. And then you should be picking up a heavier weight. I mean, I'm a huge drop set fan.
Mm-hmm.
But I was curious your take on drop sets. I think that's just like drop sets for me are just such a great way to get me to the next level and try something, and then drop down to get to the fatigue and then build that strength and even confidence to pick up a heavier weight,
Yeah. Yeah. I'm a fan of drop sets as well. I think they're an efficient way to train.
Yeah. Can you talk about what they are?
Yeah. So drop sets are cool because, I mean, you're lifting a weight and you will drop to a lighter weight when you reach fatigue or failure and continue to do repetitions. In some ways, it's like a hybrid between high load and low load training, although, it depends on your drop. But when you finish lifting a weight, your level of fatigue is enough to not be able to lift that weight. So if you were to do just low load training, you get to when you fail, you can no longer lift a really light weight. When you do high load training, when you fail, you can no longer lift a heavy weight. So by definition, you're more fatigued with low load training than high load training.
Oh, interesting.
Because you get to the point where you can't lift something that's quite light. So I always think that's interesting. So drop set is lifting a heavy weight and then jumping to a lighter weight. And you have some level of fatigue, but you're not fatigued enough not to be able to lift that light weight. And drop set training is kind of capitalizing on the metabolic environment. So when you put down that weight, you've pre-fatigued that muscle. And that lighter weight's probably going to feel more difficult than it typically would. And you're not taking that to failure. So you're getting additional effective volume. And, some people will drop more than once. Maybe you drop a third time to even lighter weight. And in my mind, some people will do, and I've done this before, 2 or 3 drop sets, like heavyweight, lightweight, lighter weight, and do that 3 times. But I could see an argument, and I know people would disagree with this. That first drop set might get you the majority of what you can get out of that movement. And I could see moving on after doing one really good drop set.
Yeah.
And maybe that's enough to maximize what you can get out of that movement. So from an efficiency standpoint, I think they're great. From a mechanistic standpoint of understanding muscle growth, I think they're really good at fatigue and activating muscle. So you're activating all the fibers involved in that movement and stimulating that muscle growth response largely and just across your drop sets. I think you're achieving the majority of what you can achieve.
Have you ever done the rack, the bar, like just a bicep curl, go down the rack? It's a really fun finisher. Like I'll get with like one of my bro lifting chick friends or a guy, and it's just like, we're just like, let's just do some crazy stuff. Like it's, you pick up the heaviest dumbbell you can do for 5, and then you just work your way down the rack until you like the 5s feel like they're 100 pounds, and it's hilarious. And you just get the best pump ever, and off you go.
I don't think I've ever done the whole rack, but I got to like 5s or 10s on lateral raises the other day, and I was just kind of being goofy and funny.
Yeah, right.
And I'm like, what the heck? I'm going to do one more drop here, and I dropped to like the 10s, which would normally be so light, but they felt heavy. So
right.
It's kind of cool to do that too.
Right.
Like make something that
just
shouldn't be
fun,
heavy.
Yeah, right, right. So how important is form? This is a question I get a lot. People are afraid to go heavy because of form. Because I always just say, like, hire a trainer. If you want to go heavy and you just need somebody to watch you and you don't know your form, but how important is form? I have my thoughts.
Yeah, I think it depends on the movement. obviously from an injury prevention perspective, certain movements in proper form could lead to injury. So your squats, your deadlifts, I think you have to be mindful, and you don't want to go heavy with poor mechanics where you're loading your spine in a way that's going to lead to an injury. Outside of that, I think form dictates what muscle is going to be activated, right? So the idea of a foot placement impacting, are you going to have more quadricep or more glute activation in this movement? Are you executing the movement in a way that you're fatiguing the muscle that's intended to be fatigued in order to experience the muscle growth that is the goal of this movement? So I guess there's two different views on technique. The one is the injury side, and the other is the activation side. And I think they're both important to consider. Now, some people would also take technique to mean, are you executing the full range of motion with the absolute control? And I think that's the one where some of that's training preference, because you have the people that want to just kind of slam the weights and lift heavy. And there's other people that are kind of more technique snobs. They'll be like, no, you need to lower the weight and do slow controlled reps. I can see a scenario where both of those can be effective. Maybe one's associated with a greater injury risk. But when I think of form and technique, I tend to think of, are we activating the muscles that are intended to be activated and fatigued in this movement? And, if you do an exercise wrong, you might fatigue your hamstrings before your glutes. And you don't, maybe your goal is to fatigue your glutes, or maybe you're using too much quad. And again, your goal is to fatigue your glutes. So improper technique can lead to targeting the wrong muscle, or maybe your lower back is giving out before you can actually fatigue your legs. So in those instances, the technique could be impeding your ability to grow your muscle. It probably matters less on simple movements, on machine movements. And one of the things why I think a lot of people like machines are, it takes out some of that complexity and helps you ensure that you're just targeting this muscle. So simple machine movements are a good way to have targeted muscle growth. Although, maybe they're less functional for some of our day-to-day life.
Right. I mean, most people I see in the gym form is pretty close. Like maybe they're using a little momentum for a bicep curl. That never bothers me. Also, I really try not to, I'm just happy to see people in the gym. I'm not a teaser. You know what I mean? Like it's like, it's good you're there. It's good that you're moving. And I think definitely there are some exercises where I will leverage a little bit of momentum to get the weight up and then really take advantage of the negative or eccentric movement, which is where, I mean, that's the hard part anyway, Yeah. So
I also think people feel different movements differently. So
yeah,
I don't think two people like necessarily have to do an exercise the same way. And I think a lot of people get stuck in the way of how they're doing it, and they perceive that as the correct way. Or even within a movement, a good example I can think of is in the hamstring curl, I get more out of the squeeze, whereas Holly gets more out of the lengthened position. So our preference in the range of motion is actually different, but it's how I connect with my muscle and how much range of motion and flexibility she has that lead to, we fatigue differently across an exercise set. So I think overall, I'm not super rigid on these things, but there probably are instances where improved technique could just help improve the efficiency of fatiguing the muscle that you care to fatigue with that exercise. I do think sometimes we overcomplicate things, and it just scares people away from ever walking into the gym.
Right. I'm going to do this wrong. And it's like, well, being back at CrossFit, it really in this last year and dabbling back in it and now being a little more committed. One of the reasons I went into it was because the coaching is so good. Like I knew that my squat needed I mean, I was not engaging my glutes at all, like at
Mm-hmm.
all. My quads will take over everything, everything. So having somebody be able to see and help me and be able to see that, it's changed my ability to like do the movement well, get to depth, build confidence. So like, I think that's a good example of like how a slight form tweak
Yeah.
really helped me get the right effect and build strength in a movement that I was previously like just like not totally comfortable with.
Yeah.
Yeah. Same thing with bench.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think also people feel obligated to do certain movements, and that might be a barrier to them
True.
engaging in the gym. And I think if that is someone's hang up, then just do what you're comfortable doing. And, there's no rule that says you have to squat. And if you don't
Sure.
squat, you don't actually train. Maybe squat's not for you. So maybe you find exercises that work the same muscles that you are comfortable doing. And maybe you find someone to help you work on your squat if that's still a goal or still a movement that you value. But I think oftentimes we kind of create this idea that, these are the key movements, or these are the essential movements that everyone should be doing or everyone needs to do, or they're a gauge of, are you an actual lifter?
Yeah, I mean,
But
people make fun of kickbacks a lot, glute kickbacks. Like, oh, you get depending on what camp you're in or what community you're in, but it's like, and I was there too. Like, that's just not necessary. But the more I've learned and talked about targeting and understand that, and I did my own little bodybuilding competition. It's like there's room for all of it, which is what's exciting, but it's also what is overwhelming.
Mhm.
That paralysis analysis thing.
Yeah.
I have one more question.
Sure.
Okay. So in class, we talked quite a bit. There was like one class in particular about tendons. I think we went into ligaments and that kind of thing too. And we were saying, I don't know if I'm remembering this correctly. One of the limiting factors of strength would be like, I don't remember if it was tendon strength, because it was like, well, I would never walk into a gym and like pick up a max weight. I need time to build strength to be able to do that. But it's coming from places that aren't just that muscle. There's more to the movement and building strength than just like, did this muscle get stronger?
I'm trying to think of what class that might have been.
Maybe it wasn't. I don't know. Maybe it wasn't.
So
Yeah.
it could have been this.
Like I have people who say, "Oh, I started lifting heavy, but I'm aching, my joints,
Yeah.
I feel like."
We
yeah,
did talk about how a lot of the soreness you feel is near your muscle tendon unit. So,
yeah. Okay.
when you get sore, it's not untypical for, like, if you do bicep curls, you're gonna get sore right here. And that's when you're touching your muscle and feeling the soreness, you're feeling your muscle tendon junction, like your muscle's tapering in a tendon, which is attached into the bone. So often that's where we kind of experience our soreness, especially when you lift heavy. When you lift lighter, your soreness is actually more so in the middle of the muscle belly. But what I'm wondering if maybe you're referencing a conversation we had on voluntary strength. So we did talk about the fact that you can't access all of your strength. And part of the reason why is because, maybe if you do access all of your strength, you become injured because your tendons,
Interesting.
your muscles transmit force through the connective tissue. And maybe if you expressed all of your strength, you'd be subject to injury. So that discussion actually kind of came from some data. And again, this may not be what you're remembering, but maybe it is. I talked about a paper that looked at removing inhibitions. And it was a paper from like the 50s. So these are not things that would get approved by an IRB at a university in 2024. But basically they fired a shotgun behind people's heads while they're producing force. And they found
you could probably do that in Florida still.
Maybe in Florida, yeah.
Jeez.
And when they did that, they got stronger. So when they shocked them, they didn't know what was going to happen. They got this sympathetic response and their strength increased. They had them drink alcohol to remove inhibition. And the right dose increased strength a little bit. They had them take.
Do not get any. I just thinking. Oh
no! This is not a recommendation.
I'm just kidding.
It's probably a very small amount. They had them, especially now, they had them take like some type of methamphetamine, and they use multiple different drugs and stimuli to try to bypass voluntary activation. And they found that you basically have a strength reserve. You have strength that you cannot access. And I think that's why in situations where it might be a life or death scenario, we can express greater strength than we can voluntarily.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So that's the lift the school bus.
Yeah.
And it's proof. It's not even like a theory. It's like it actually happens.
Well, I think there's voluntary strength and there's involuntary strength.
Interesting.
But perhaps we're not meant to access all of that strength. And I think of, I saw this video of a person that was on like one of these paragliders or so they were jumping out on this huge kite and they realized they weren't clipped in, right? So they're hundreds of feet up in the air on this kite, and the only thing keeping them from falling is their grip strength. The person survived, and I remember watching this video, but both of their biceps were torn off the bone by the time they got to the ground.
Wow.
And I have to think they were able to produce enough force to save their life, but at the cost of significant injury.
Right. Interesting. Just superheroes.
Yeah. So I do think we possess a strength reserve, meaning we don't ever access the full potential of our muscle, because I think if we did, we're limited by the strength of our connective tissue, right? So maybe you are stronger than you can express, but maybe if you expressed all that strength, you'd be subject to injury.
Wow. Jen Thompson is a Olympic and like world champion power lifter. She's my age and she's my height, my weight exactly. So she's 5'6", 140, 50 years old. She's been on my podcast. She benches 340 something, I think. She's been doing it. Might have that. It might be like 326 is popping to my head. So she's breaks all the records, obviously. And she's savage. She's a school teacher and she has a sweet little voice. You would never know it. She actually told me on my podcast that I had like limiting beliefs about my own strength. Like, cause I was like, how do you do that? How is that possible? And she's like, you just add another pound. Like you don't think about what's limiting you. I mean, it's very unusual, that type of strength. She's been lifting with her husband together with the bros since like high school and college. So it's unreal. It's unreal to me.
Yeah. There's research on that as well, where they like covered the weights versus didn't cover the weights.
Oh, so yeah. I never want to know. Yeah.
Kind of hid the weight, and people were able to express greater strength when they weren't intimidated by, what the weight actually was.
Right.
So perception and belief, I think, definitely does also play a role. And maybe that's part of what's limiting our voluntary strength.
Right.
It's interesting.
To protect us. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like she's cracked the code,
Yeah, it sounds like it. I mean, with that type of number at that weight, that's unbelievable.
It's insane. She's not, and it's always like mass moves mass. It's like, well, not really, because she's kind of a peanut.
Explain this one.
Yeah, right. Like, so these things come up. It's like the milkshake study, these things come up and it's like every once in a while, somebody seems to be able to crack that. It's her strength is unexplainable to me. Even if you were like, oh, she's performance enhanced, it still doesn't explain it. You know what I mean? That's fine. But that's a kind of strength and power that's like unbelievable. And you can't, you don't just get that training a few years. So, So what are your goals? Physical goals?
Oh, I haven't thought about that in a long time, actually. That's a good question.
I was curious if you were still doing your gymnastics moves or if that's just something that you
I haven't in a
play
while.
around with.
I I wouldn't mind getting back to it. I think it's just a matter of having the time
Mm,
to focus my training more. I think things have been so busy lately
mm.
that my training's taken a bit of a um, it's still there, but it's not at the forefront of my mind or anything I'm trying to accomplish. Um, I think I would love to revisit my 90-degree push-ups
Yeah, that was cool.
and at a certain point I was progressing to learn new skills or like come up with new skills because with calisthenics, with bodyweight movements, what is fun to me is kind of trying to do something that someone else can't do or hasn't done. Um, and I haven't done that in a while. So maybe it's time to start getting back on a goal. I kind of like the idea of that. I just, things have been so busy with tenure and then the
Yeah.
lab and everything
Well, you
going
want
on.
to pop on social media, you do more of that because
Yeah.
that's like really interesting. I mean, I've watched that one video for people listening and watching. Go check out his social media. It's the Instagram, did you say it's a 90-degree push-up, right?
Yeah, 90
Yeah,
degree, 90
it
degree
does.
push-up.
I was like, oh, that's like a AI, like that people like human beings can't do that. So it's really fun to watch
Yeah.
because you just think, how is that possible?
Especially
Yeah.
as I get older, I think it would be cool to try to maintain as much of that as I can.
Yeah, for sure.
Because my 20s I was really good at it, and now in my 30s, it's not as easy as it used to be.
I know.
Things just hurt a little bit more, but I think I still got it. I haven't given up on that stuff yet.
Yeah. I still got it. Well, you do. And I mean, even at 51, I talk about this a lot. It's like there's a constant need to adapt. Like as things don't feel good anymore, you don't like once running blows up your knee, like don't get a knee replacement so you can keep running. Like it's time to do something else. I had this talk with a good friend of mine who's stuck on marathon, endurance. And I'm like, it's time. Like you're 40, you don't need a knee replacement to keep running.
Mm-hmm.
I was told the same thing at one point, like you're going to need one. And I was like, well, no, I'm going to change my training and strengthen the areas that need. And that's what's exciting to me is now like decades of training, seeing like what you can still do as you age,
Yeah.
and that's super exciting.
Oh, yeah.
The body is amazing. And I just feel like for me, it's always like it wants to be healthy and it wants to perform for me. I just always have to figure out what is best for it and not keep like jamming myself into doing the same things that are creating discomfort. And that's exciting. There's so many things to do. So I just always feel blessed to be in the industry, to be able to know that it's okay to change things around and, try new things. But the basics, what I like about this discussion is that the basics of building muscle they have to be there.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like to be able to get those improvements, they have to be there and they're going to be small,
Yeah.
So
small, but over time, maybe they'll be big.
Yeah.
Just be patient and yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time.
Yeah.
I appreciate
Thanks for
it.
having me on.
Everyone will be able to find you on social media now. And I feel like this was helpful and maybe we'll have you on again if you're, ever open to it. But thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Of course. You're welcome.
All right. We'll talk soon.
Okay.
Bye.